You already think you know this story. You don't. Nobody does. That's exactly the problem. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world ever assembled, did not burn in a single dramatic fire. It was not destroyed in one night by Julius Caesar's torches. It was not razed by a mob of Christians following a fanatical bishop. It did not fall to the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 AD. All three of those stories exist. All three have been told as the definitive account at various points in history. And all three are wrong, not entirely false, but wrong in the way that matters most. Wrong about who killed it. Wrong about when. Wrong about why. The real story is more disturbing than any fire, because the real killer left no smoke, no ash, no moment you could point to and say, there. That is when the world lost everything. To understand what was destroyed, you first have to understand what the library actually was. Most people imagine a building, a grand hall, shelves stacked floor to ceiling, scrolls lined up like soldiers. That image is almost completely wrong. The Library of Alexandria was not primarily a building. It was an institution, the ancient world's first attempt at something that had never existed before. A state-funded research center, attached to a complex called the Mausoleum, the Temple of the Muses, built in the early 3rd century BC under Ptolemy I, expanded aggressively by his son Ptolemy II. The Ptolemies had a singular obsession. They wanted to own a copy of every book ever written. Not some books, not many books. Every book. In any language. From any culture. The acquisition policy was extraordinary by any standard, ancient or modern. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was boarded by royal agents. Any scrolls found on board were confiscated, copied, and the copies, not the originals, were returned to the owners. The originals went to the library. When Ptolemy III borrowed the official Athenian state copies of the plays of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, priceless cultural treasures Athens had guarded for over a century, he paid the enormous deposit required, had them copied, sent the copies back to Athens, and kept the originals. He forfeited the deposit without hesitation. The originals were worth more than any sum Athens could name. At its peak, the library held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. The range matters, ancient sources disagree, and the disagreement itself tells you something about how vast and difficult to catalog the collection had become. These were not books in the modern sense. Each scroll held roughly what we would recognize as one chapter of a modern book. A single work, Aristotle's complete writings, for instance, might occupy 150 scrolls. The works housed in Alexandria included original manuscripts from cultures that no longer exist in any other form, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, medical texts, poetry, philosophy, engineering manuals, maps of the known world, religious texts from traditions that were already ancient when Rome was young. This was not a collection of books. It was the accumulated intellectual output of the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. Now the fires. Because there were fires, that part of the story is true. The first came in 48 BC, during Julius Caesar's occupation of Alexandria. Caesar was outnumbered and trapped in the harbor. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him, he ordered ships in the harbor set alight. The fire spread. It reached the docks. It destroyed, according to some ancient sources, 40,000 scrolls stored in a warehouse near the waterfront. This is the fire most people picture when they imagine the destruction of the library. But 40,000 scrolls was not the library. 40,000 scrolls was the library's overflow, a secondary depot for scrolls awaiting cataloging and shelving. The main collection inside the Mausoleum was untouched. Caesar's fire was real. Caesar's fire was not the end. The second destruction came in 270 AD, under the Roman Emperor Aurelian. Civil war had fractured the empire. A breakaway state called the Pomeranian Empire, led by the formidable Queen Zenobia, had seized Egypt and Alexandria. When Aurelian recaptured the city, the fighting was savage. The district called the Brucheian, the royal quarter where the Mausoleum and library stood, was destroyed in the fighting. How much of the library survived is unknown. Ancient sources are vague, contradictory, or simply silent. What we know is that after Aurelian, references to the Great Library as a living, functioning institution become sparse and troubled. The third event is the one that has generated the most controversy. In 391 AD, the Christian bishop Theophilus, acting under orders from Emperor Theodosius, who had banned all pagan worship, led a campaign to destroy Alexandria's pagan temples. The Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex that housed what some scholars believe was a secondary library collection, the daughter library, was attacked, ransacked, and demolished. A pagan mathematician and philosopher named Hypatia was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 AD, dragged from her chariot, killed, her body burned. These events are real. They were violent. They represented a profound cultural rupture. But the Serapeum was not the library. The daughter library, if it still existed at all by 391, was a remnant, a fraction of what the original collection had been. Then there is the Arab account. In 642 AD, the Arab general Amr ibn Alas conquered Alexandria for the Caliph Omar. A later story, appearing in sources written 500 years after the conquest, claims that when asked what to do with the library, the Caliph responded, "If these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Burn them." Modern historians reject this story almost universally. The sourcing is too late, the politics too convenient, the archaeology too silent. By 642 AD, there was almost certainly no library left to burn. Which brings us to the actual question. If not Caesar, if not Theophilus, if not the Arab conquest, then what? The answer is not dramatic. It does not make for a good film. It is, for that reason, the answer that has been systematically ignored for 17 centuries. The Library of Alexandria was killed by funding cuts, by bureaucratic neglect, by the slow withdrawal of the political will that had created and sustained it. The Ptolemaic kings who built the library believed that knowledge was power in the most literal sense, that owning the intellectual output of the entire world gave Egypt a strategic advantage over every other civilization on earth. They funded it accordingly. They paid scholars to live and work at the Mauseon, not occasionally, but as a permanent salaried class, freed from any obligation except thinking. When Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC, that political logic dissolved. Rome already controlled the world. It did not need Alexandria's knowledge advantage. It needed Alexandria's grain. The library became, in Roman eyes, an expensive curiosity, a monument to a conquered culture's pretensions. Funding declined. Scholars left. Acquisitions slowed, then stopped. Scrolls deteriorated. Papyrus is not immortal. And without continuous resources for copying, repair, and replacement, a collection of 700,000 scrolls begins to die from the inside. The greatest library in the ancient world did not fall in a night. It fell across 300 years of not being cared for. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable, because it does not have a villain you can point at. It does not have a single moment of catastrophe you can mourn. It has something worse. It has a series of ordinary decisions made by ordinary administrators who had other priorities. It has the specific tragedy of something extraordinary being allowed to become unimportant. Think about what was in those scrolls. We know from references in texts that survived that the library held works we have never seen, plays by Sophocles beyond the 7 we have. The complete works of Aristotle we have perhaps 1/3. Astronomical observations from Babylonian and Egyptian traditions going back thousands of years. A complete account of Egyptian history written by an Egyptian priest named Manetho. We have only fragments, preserved by accident in other people's summaries. Medical texts from traditions whose insights we are only now, 2,000 years later, beginning to rediscover. We do not know what we lost. That is the precise horror of it. You cannot mourn a specific book. You can only sit with the knowledge that somewhere in those 400,000 scrolls was an answer to a question we are still asking. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed by fire. It was destroyed by the oldest force in human history, The decision that some knowledge is not worth the cost of keeping it alive.